Hey friends, welcome back. Coming to you from my favorite spot in my backyard. Today is part 3 in my series, How to Create a Career Out of a Hobby. Stick around. Welcome back, friends. If you're new here, I'm Jen, single mom, artist, and entrepreneur. And this channel is all about helping other single parents build a life that they love and do it all by themselves. Today is part 3 in my series, How to Create a Career Out of a Hobby. Now, what do you think is the least fun part about starting a business? If you said all the money going out, you would be right. Expenses is by far the least fun part about starting a business. However, knowing what your expenses are going to be is an incredibly important detail in getting started on planning to start a business. So let's talk about what some of those expenses might be. The first and most obvious is supplies for whatever it is that you're selling, whether it's a product or a service. So if you're making a product, obviously the supplies are things like, well, whatever it takes to make that product, right? Even if you sell a service, chances are there are still some supplies that go into that. For instance, if you're a massage therapist, supplies include sheets and towels and massage oil. If you're a photographer, supplies include SD cards and batteries and maybe even some props. So supplies is probably the broadest category and probably the category that's going to have the greatest number of items in it, but not necessarily the most expensive items. Next, you're going to have equipment. Is there specialty equipment you need in order to make or sell that supply? For instance, with massage therapy, I use a towel warmer to warm my towels. That's equipment. As a photographer, obviously I have to have a camera. It's kind of a super important piece of equipment. For my stained glass business, I have soldering irons and a grinder and a saw and glass cutters, measuring tools, drawing tools, all kinds of different equipment that goes into making stained glass. Equipment can be a sizable expense, but it doesn't have to be. A lot of times people spend money on equipment that they think they're going to need and they just don't. I highly recommend if renting some of that equipment to find out how much you're going to use it and how much you truly need it. If that's an option for the thing that you're doing, you should absolutely look into that. I have rented lenses occasionally when I've only needed a specialty lens for one project. It's a lot more cost effective than spending $500 or $600 or more on a specialty lens that I'm really only going to use that one time. Marketing. So this can include website hosting costs. If you go to events, the cost of attending those events, advertising, print, radio, whatever, business cards. Basically anything you use to advertise your business is a marketing expense. Or anywhere you go to advertise your business, networking groups and things like that can sometimes be lumped into a marketing expense, or at least I consider them a marketing expense. You might need additional training. So additional training is definitely a potential expense. Maybe you need to learn a specialty that goes along with your field. So for instance, if I want to learn a new lighting technique, it might be in my best interest to take a class somewhere, and that's considered training. Or if I want a new modality to practice in massage therapy, that continuing education is a training expense. Fees that you're going to pay. So if you use a credit card processor, which these days it's pretty impossible not to accept credit cards, right? And there's all kinds of credit card processing companies out there. Square, PayPal, Stripe are just the 3 that come to mind off the top of my head. All of those charge a fee to use their service. Usually there's a flat fee plus a % depending on the amount, things of that nature. But that amount, those fees, are part of the cost of doing business. So you have to consider them in your expenses because they are an expense. Any commissions that you might pay to a third party, such as if you have an Etsy store, the commissions that you pay to Etsy to have your products there and sell them through their marketplace, those are a fee that you need to consider. And theoretically, you should consider them first before setting your price because they're going to come straight off the top of your profit. So you definitely need to know what those fees are and consider them in the way that you price your items. Insurance. Now I know it's not an exciting topic, but every business should have liability insurance at the absolute bare minimum. Even a craft business, because say for instance, I do a lot of markets and I take a tent that I use to set up under. Well, if there were some crazy high winds and that tent were picked up and flew across the parking lot and landed on somebody's car, that's what liability insurance is for, to cover the property damage caused by the tent and, God forbid, any medical bills that might be incurred by that tent hitting somebody. So liability insurance at the absolute bare minimum. You should also consider errors and omissions if you have a business that functions using contracts. And there's probably equipment insurance, coverage for supplies and product. There's lots of different kinds of insurances out there, and you should definitely talk to an agent to find out which coverages are going to be best for you. But liability at an absolute bare minimum definitely should be in your plan. And the last one on my list to talk about is licensing. Now, this is probably not the last potential expense, especially if you're just starting up. Startups have a ton of expenses to consider. Licensing definitely can be a big one. So for instance, my massage license, I believe it's $250 every 4 years to renew. That might not be right. I can't honestly remember off the top of my head. I don't have to have a business license per se in the state of Indiana, but if you're set up as an LLC or an incorporation, there are probably yearly fees associated with keeping that status current with your state. Definitely, if you live in a state or county that requires a business license, that probably needs to be renewed annually or biannually or somewhere along those lines. I'm also a notary public, and that has to be renewed every 2 years, I believe. So know what things you need licensing wise and how often they renew. Make sure you keep track of that and get those renewals in on time, and just know what those fees are, and also be aware that they can change at any time. When I first got my notary license, it was good for 8 years. Now I have to do CE every 2 years and pay a fee to keep that license valid. So things change. New legislation happens all the time and things change. So make sure that you are paying attention and keeping an eye out on any of those licensures that you may hold, to know what's happening with them in your state. This is far from a comprehensive list, but this gives you a good idea of some baseline things to start thinking about as far as the kinds of expenses you're going to be needing to be aware of and figure into your budget. And all of those expenses should go into figuring out what you're going to charge for your product or your service. All of those expenses are part of your cost of doing business. And knowing your cost of doing business is a really important starting point for figuring out what you are going to charge for your service or your products. Because there's no point in setting a price that you're going to charge if it doesn't even begin to come close to covering all of your business expenses. Businesses that aren't profitable aren't really businesses, and they certainly don't last. So you can tell it's getting close to evening here because my cicadas are out. I did just want to share with you a little view of my favorite tree here from inside the canopy. It's a magnolia tree. Look how beautiful that is. So thanks for joining me today. I hope you found this valuable. Please feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.